30 worst terrible ways to die in the Old West. The Old West was a wild and brutal land where every day was a fight for survival. From deadly diseases and violent shootouts to the merciless elements and unpredictable wildlife, life on the frontier was full of hazards. Number 30. Gunfights and shootouts. These shootouts were more than just dramatic scenes from movies. They were real-life events that often had deadly outcomes. Take the famous shooter at the OK Corral, for instance. It happened in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881. The Earp brothers, along with Doc Holliday, faced off against the Clanton and McClary gang. The gunfight lasted just 30 seconds, but it was enough to leave 3 men dead and cement the event in Wild West history. It was all about quick draws and sharp shooting. These duels were a common way to settle disputes back then. If you had a problem with someone, you didn't always go to court. You might just meet them in the street for a showdown. The quick draw was a deadly skill that could mean the difference between life and death. It was about being fast, accurate, and sometimes just plain lucky. Can you imagine the adrenaline rush and sheer fear of standing face to face with someone, knowing one of you might not walk away? That's the brutal reality they lived in. Wait till you hear about this next one. Number 29. Scalping by Native American tribes. The Old West wasn't just about cowboys and gunfights. It was also a time of intense conflict between settlers and Native American tribes. One of the most brutal practices that emerged from these clashes was scalping. Sounds horrific, right? It was a form of warfare that sent a clear and terrifying message. Scalping involved removing the scalp, completely with hair, from an enemy's head. This practice was used by various Native American tribes, and later, settlers adopted it too. It wasn't just about the act itself. It was a symbol of victory and prowess in battle. For many tribes, a scalp represented a trophy and proof of bravery and skill in combat. The conflicts between settlers and Native Americans were rooted in a struggle for land and resources. As settlers pushed westward, they encroached on Native American territories, leading to fierce resistance. These clashes were brutal and unforgiving, with both sides committing acts that would terrify us today. Speaking of deadly, have you ever heard about? Number 28, disease and epidemics. If you think life in the Old West was tough because of gunfights and harsh living conditions, imagine dealing with deadly diseases without any of the medical knowledge or treatments we have today. The settlers faced epidemics of smallpox, cholera, and tuberculosis, which swept through communities like wildfire. Back then, there were no antibiotics, vaccines, or even a good understanding of how diseases spread. People relied on home remedies and what little medical help was available, but it was often not enough. The lack of proper medical care meant that even a minor infection could become fatal. Entire towns could be wiped out by an epidemic, leaving behind ghost towns as a grim reminder of the deadly threats that lurked in everyday life. Imagine watching your family and friends succumb to these diseases, knowing there was little you could do to help. The fear and helplessness must have been overwhelming. It's a stark contrast to today, where we have advanced medical care and vaccines to protect us from such outbreaks. The settler struggle with disease is a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the advancements we often take for granted. Which brings us to another terrifying way to go. Number 27, snake bites.
Look out! Let me handle it.
Imagine walking through the tall grass or rocky trails of the Old West, constantly on the lookout for rattlesnakes. These venomous snakes were a common threat and could turn a routine journey into a life-or-death situation in an instant. Rattlesnakes, with their distinctive rattling sound, were the most infamous, but there were also other venomous snakes like copperheads and cottonmouths. A snake bite in the Old West was a serious and often fatal event. Antivenom, which we rely on today to treat venomous bites, wasn't developed until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before that, there was little that could be done beyond the crude first aid.
Get it! Jump!
People used various folk remedies, some of which might have been more harmful than helpful. For instance, they might try to suck out the venom or make incisions around the bite, but these methods were largely ineffective and could lead to infections. Without proper medical care, the effects of a venomous snake bite were horrifying. Victims would experience intense pain, swelling, and tissue damage. The venom could cause paralysis and interfere with breathing, leading to a slow and agonizing death. But that's not all. Let's dive into number 26, lynching and vigilante justice. The concept of justice in the Old West was often a brutal and swift affair, with lynching being a grim example. Imagine living in a place where the law was thinly spread, and sometimes people took justice into their own hands. Lynching, or extrajudicial hanging, became a common form of frontier justice when communities decided to bypass the legal system. Lynch mobs formed for various reasons, often driven by a mix of fear, anger, and a desire for quick retribution. The targets were usually those accused of serious crimes like murder, theft, or assault. However, the line between guilt and innocence was often blurred, and many lynchings were based on rumors or prejudice. African Americans, Native Americans, and other minorities were particularly vulnerable to this form of vigilante justice. One notable case was the lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abraham Smith in Marion, Indiana, in 1930, which, although a bit later in history, reflects the same brutal mindset prevalent in the Old West. Accused of murdering a white factory worker and raping his companion, they were forcibly taken from jail by a mob, beaten, and hanged. If you thought that was bad, get ready for number 25, starvation and dehydration. Life in the Old West wasn't just about surviving gunfights or avoiding snake bites. It was also about enduring the harsh and unforgiving environment. Starvation and dehydration were constant threats, especially for pioneers and settlers who ventured into unknown territories. Imagine being part of a wagon train, crossing vast stretches of arid land with limited supplies. The journey was grueling, and securing enough food and water was a relentless challenge. Sometimes settlers would run out of provisions, far from any source of help. Hunting and foraging provided some sustenance, but game could be scarce, and edible plants were not always easy to find. The story of the Donner Party is a chilling example. In 1846, this group of pioneers set out for California, but got trapped by heavy snowfall in the Sierra Nevada mountains. As their food supplies dwindled, they faced unimaginable choices. Some resorted to cannibalism to survive, eating the flesh of those who had already died. It's a horrific tale of desperation that highlights just how dire the situation could become. Hold on to your hats for this one. Number 24, animal attacks. Living in the Old West meant sharing the land with some pretty dangerous wildlife. You're out on the frontier, miles from any town, and suddenly you find yourself face to face with a bear, a wolf, or even a cougar. These encounters were more common than you might think, and they often had deadly outcomes. Bears, especially grizzlies, were a significant threat. They could be incredibly aggressive, particularly if they felt threatened or were protecting their young. There are numerous tales of settlers and pioneers who met their end after a brutal bear attack. Imagine the sheer power of a grizzly and the helplessness of facing one with just a rifle or a knife. Wolves also posed a danger, often hunting in packs. While wolves generally avoided humans, hunger or provocation could lead to deadly encounters. A lone traveler or a small group could easily become prey. Then there were cougars, or mountain lions, which stalked their victims silently before striking with deadly precision. These big cats were stealthy and powerful, making them a serious threat in the wild. Next up, let's explore the grim fate of number 23, mining accidents. Mining in the Old West was a dangerous business. Imagine working in dark, cramped tunnels deep underground with a constant risk of disaster looming over you. The conditions were perilous and accidents were all too common. Cave-ins were a frequent hazard. Miners would dig in unstable ground, and without modern safety equipment or reinforced structures, the tunnels could collapse without warning. Trapped miners often suffocated or were crushed under tons of earth and rock. The darkness and confined spaces made rescue attempts incredibly difficult and often futile. Explosions were another deadly risk. Miners used dynamite to blast through rock, but handling explosives was a risky job. A single spark or a miscalculation could trigger a blast, causing horrific injuries or instant death. Poisoning was also a concern, as miners were exposed to toxic gases and heavy metals without any protective gear. Prolonged exposure could lead to serious health issues and premature death. And now, let's talk about number 22, exposure to harsh weather. The weather in the Old West could be as deadly as any gunfight or wild animal. Imagine trying to survive in an environment where you could face extreme heat one day and bone-chilling cold the next. Exposure to harsh weather conditions was a constant threat, and it claimed many lives. Hypothermia was a real danger, especially during the harsh winters. Settlers and travelers could get caught in sudden snowstorms with temperatures plummeting rapidly. Without proper shelter or warm clothing, it didn't take long for the cold to become deadly. Stories of people freezing to death in blizzards are all too common. They'd be found later, huddled together, having tried in vain to keep warm. The Donner Party's tragic tale isn't just about starvation, it's also about the deadly cold. Trapped by early snowfall in the Sierra Nevada, they faced brutal winter conditions without adequate supplies or shelter. Exposure to the cold was one of the many horrors they endured. These stories highlight the unforgiving nature of the frontier weather and the constant struggle for survival against the elements. But wait, there's more. Check out number 21, drowning. Crossing rivers and other water bodies in the Old West was fraught with peril. Imagine trying to ford a river with a heavy wagon, your family, and all your possessions, knowing one wrong move could spell disaster. Drowning was a common and tragic end for many pioneers and settlers. Rivers could be deceptively calm on the surface, but strong currents and hidden obstacles below could easily overturn a wagon or sweep a person away. Without proper bridges or ferries, fording rivers was often the only option. Many lost their lives attempting to cross swollen rivers during the spring thaw or after heavy rains. The stories of entire families being swept away are heart-wrenching. During the westward migration, pioneers had to cross numerous rivers. The Oregon Trail, for example, involved crossing several major rivers, each presenting its own challenges. Accounts from the time describe the anxiety and fear settlers felt as they approached these crossings. Drowning incidents were so frequent that they became a grim reality of life on the trail. Let's switch gears and jump into number 20, accidental shootings. In the Old West, carrying a firearm was as common as wearing a hat. Almost everyone had a gun, whether for protection, hunting, or just because it was part of the culture. But with so many firearms around, accidental shootings were an unfortunate and frequent occurrence. It's easy to imagine the chaos and danger of living in a time when guns were everywhere and not everyone knew how to handle them safely. Accidental discharges happened all the time. Picture someone cleaning their gun, not realizing it was loaded, and suddenly, bang, a shot goes off. Or think about a person carrying a gun in their pocket or waistband and it accidentally fires. These incidents could happen in the blink of an eye and often resulted in tragic outcomes. There's a story from Dodge City one of those iconic Wild West towns, where a young boy was playing with his father's revolver. He didn't realize it was loaded and accidentally shot his younger sister. It's a heartbreaking reminder of how dangerous these weapons could be, especially in the hands of the inexperienced or careless. Now, here's a way to die that really takes the cake. Number 19. Train and stagecoach robberies. Traveling by train or stagecoach in the Old West was an adventure fraught with danger, not least because of the ever-present threat of robbery. Imagine being on a stagecoach, bouncing along a dusty trail when suddenly masked outlaws appear, guns drawn, demanding money and valuables. It's the stuff of Western movies, but for many, it was a terrifying reality. Train and stagecoach robberies were all too common. Outlaws targeted these modes of transportation because they often carried significant amounts of money, gold, and other valuables. Trains in particular were seen as lucrative targets. Robbers would force the train to stop, usually by blocking the tracks, then board and loot the passengers and cargo. One infamous case was the Great Train Robbery of 1877 by the Reno Gang. They stopped a train in Indiana, looted the express car, and made off with a substantial amount of money. This daring heist became legendary and inspired countless other would-be robbers. Shifting our focus, have you ever heard about? Number 18. Cannibalism in extreme situations. When we talk about the Old West, one of the most horrifying and desperate situations people faced was cannibalism. It's hard to even imagine the level of desperation that would drive someone to eat human flesh, but there are documented cases where people had no other choice. The most infamous example is the Donner Party. In 1846, the Donner Party set out for California, but became trapped by heavy snowfall in the Sierra Nevada mountains. As their food supplies ran out, they faced an unthinkable decision: starve to death or resort to cannibalism. The survivors later recounted the harrowing experience of having to eat the bodies of those who had already died. It was a grim and desperate measure taken to stay alive in an unimaginably harsh situation. But the Donner Party wasn't the only instance. In 1874, Alfred Packer led a group of prospectors into the Colorado mountains during winter. They became snowbound, and when rescued months later, Packer was the only survivor. He claimed his companions had died, and he had no choice but to eat them to survive. Whether his account was entirely truthful or not, it highlights the extreme conditions and dire choices people faced. The next one on our list will blow your mind. Number 17. Falling from heights. In the Old West, falling from heights was a more common and deadly hazard than you might think. With a rapid expansion and construction of railroads, buildings, and other infrastructure, there were plenty of opportunities for fatal falls. Imagine working high up on a railroad bridge or on the top floor of a new building with little to no safety equipment. One misstep and it could be all over. Railroad construction was particularly dangerous. Workers had to build tracks over mountains, valleys, and rivers, often requiring the construction of tall trestles and bridges. These structures were essential for the trains to cross challenging terrains, but they were risky to build. There's a story about the construction of the Pacific Railroad, where several workers fell to their deaths while building a bridge over a deep gorge. The safety standards we have today simply didn't exist back then, and the workers knew the risks but had little choice if they wanted to earn a living. Settlers, too, faced dangers from heights. Think of the early pioneers who had to build their homes from scratch, often on uneven terrain. Falls from roofs, ladders, and even trees used for construction were common. One tragic tale tells of a settler who fell while trying to fix the roof of his cabin. He survived the fall but later died from the injuries, as there was no doctor nearby to treat him. Now, Prepare yourself for the tale of number 16, boating accidents. Traveling by boat in the Old West was a risky endeavor, whether you were navigating a calm river or a turbulent lake. Boats and rafts were essential for transporting people and goods, especially in areas where roads were non-existent or impassable. But these journeys were fraught with dangers, and many lives were lost to boating accidents. Rivers could be especially treacherous. Strong currents, hidden rocks, and sudden rapids posed constant threats. Imagine setting out on a raft, hoping to reach your destination safely, only to be swept away by a powerful current. There's a well-known story of the Green River in Wyoming, where many pioneers lost their lives trying to cross. One particular incident involved a group of settlers whose raft capsized in the swift waters, leading to several drownings. Lakes, too, had their hazards. Lake crossings were often necessary for settlers moving westward, but storms could whip up quickly, turning a calm journey into a deadly one. Small boats and rafts weren't built to withstand heavy weather, and many people were caught off guard. One account tells of a family crossing a lake in the Midwest when a sudden storm hit. Their boat capsized, and despite their efforts to swim to shore, only one family member survived. Coming up, we have the chilling story of number 15, lightning strikes. The old plains of the Old West were beautiful but could turn deadly in an instant, especially during thunderstorms. Lightning strikes were frequent and often fatal occurrence, catching people and animals alike off guard. Picture yourself out on the vast, flat plains with nowhere to hide as a thunderstorm rolls in. The sky darkens, thunder rumbles, and then, without warning, a bolt of lightning strikes. In those wide-open spaces, there was no shelter to protect against such dangers. Farmers and ranchers working in the fields were particularly vulnerable. There's a story of a cowboy who was struck by lightning while herding cattle. He didn't survive, and it was a stark reminder of the power of nature. Even being inside wasn't always a guarantee of safety. Lightnings could strike buildings, causing fires, or even traveling through chimneys and windows to injure or kill those inside. One chilling account tells of a family in their cabin when a bolt of lightning hit. It traveled through the metal chimney, striking the father who was sitting by the fireplace. He died instantly, leaving his family in shock. And now for another brutal end. Number 14, wildfires. Wildfires were a constant threat in the Old West, and they could be devastating. Imagine living in a wooden cabin, surrounded by a dry brush and tall grasses. One spark from a campfire or a lightning strike, and everything could go up in flames. Wildfires spread rapidly, often driven by strong winds, leaving little time for escape. Entire settlements could be wiped out, and the loss of life and property was often catastrophic. People had to be vigilant, always on the lookout for signs of fire and ready to evacuate at a moment's notice. The fear of wildfires was a daily reality, adding to the many challenges of frontier life. Up next, you won't believe the horror of number 13, horse accidents. In the Old West, horses were essential for transportation and work, but they also posed significant dangers. Imagine riding at full gallop when suddenly your horse gets spooked and throws you off. Or you think about working with horses on a ranch, where getting trampled and dragged by a frightened animal was a real risk. Horses were powerful and unpredictable, and accidents were common. A fall from a horse could result in serious injury or even death, and medical help was often far away. Despite the risks, people relied on horses for their livelihood, making these accidents an unavoidable part of daily life. Here's a death that still haunts the history books. Number 12, falling trees and logging accidents. Logging was a vital but dangerous occupation in the Old West. Picture yourself in a dense forest, chopping down massive trees with nothing but an axe and sheer muscle power. One wrong move and a falling tree could crush you. Logging accidents were frequent and often fatal. Trees could fall unpredictably, and the heavy timber could cause devastating injuries. Clearing forests was hard, dangerous work, and many loggers lost their lives in the process. These accidents highlighted the perils of working in such a physically demanding and hazardous environment. Let's continue with the gruesome reality of number 11, sunstroke and sunburn. The sun in the Old West could be brutal, especially for those working outdoors all day. Imagine toiling under the scorching sun with no shade in sight. Prolonged exposure could lead to severe sunburn, causing painful blisters and increasing the risk of skin infections. Even worse, heat stroke was a constant threat. Symptoms included dizziness, nausea, and confusion, and without immediate help, it could be fatal. Settlers and workers had to be mindful of the sun's power, but without modern sunscreen or reliable ways to stay cool, they often suffered the harsh consequences of sun exposure. Ready for more? Here's another shocking end. Number 10, frostbite and freezing. Winters in the Old West were unforgiving, and the lack of adequate shelter made frostbite and freezing real dangers. Imagine being caught in a sudden snowstorm and nowhere to go. The cold could be relentless, and without proper clothing or heating, it didn't take long for hypothermia to set in. Fingers, toes, or even limbs could succumb to frostbite, leading to severe injury or amputation. Many settlers and travelers faced these brutal conditions, and some didn't make it. The stories of those who froze to death are a stark reminder of the relentless and deadly winters on the frontier. Next in line, let's uncover the fate of number 9, poisoning from contaminated food and water. In the Old West, the knowledge about food preservation and water purification was limited, leading to frequent cases of poisoning. Imagine drinking from a seemingly clean stream, only to fall violently ill later. Waterborne illnesses like dysentery and cholera were common, and contaminated food could cause severe food poisoning. Settlers often lacked proper storage facilities, leading to spoiled food that still had to be eaten out of necessity. Instances of mass poisoning in settlements were not uncommon, highlighting the constant battle against unseen and deadly threats in their environment. Hold on, you're about to hear about number 8, childbirth complications. Childbirth in the Old West was fraught with danger. Without access to professional medical help, many women faced life-threatening complications. Imagine being in labor for hours with only a midwife or even a neighbor to assist. The lack of sanitation and medical knowledge meant high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. Infections, prolonged labor, and breech births often led to tragic outcomes. The absence of modern medical care made childbirth a perilous journey, and many families mourned the loss of loved ones during what should have been a joyous occasion. Moving right along, we arrive at number 7, disputes over land and resources. The Old West was a land of opportunity, but also one of fierce competition. Disputes over land and resources often turned violent. Imagine staking a claim on a piece of land, only to have someone else challenge it. These confrontations could quickly escalate to deadly altercations. Settlers, miners, and ranchers frequently found themselves in conflict over the same resources. Stories of shootouts, ambushes, and murders over land claims were all too common. The quest for prosperity often led to bloodshed, underscoring the harsh and lawless nature of frontier life. The adventure continues with number 6, blizzards and avalanches. Blizzards and avalanches were deadly forces in the mountainous regions of the Old West. Picture yourself traveling through a mountain pass when a sudden blizzard hits, visibility drops to zero, and the temperature plummets. Many settlers and travelers were caught unprepared, succumbing to the freezing cold. Avalanches were equally dangerous, with tons of snow and debris cascading down mountainsides, burying anything in their path. Accounts of entire groups being wiped out by these natural disasters are a grim reminder of the lethal power of nature in the frontier's harsh landscape. Let's not forget about the grim story of number 5, scurvy and malnutrition. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a common ailment among pioneers and miners who had limited access to fresh produce. Imagine eating a diet of mostly preserved meats and hardtack, with little to no fruits or vegetables. Symptoms included weakness, swollen gums, and eventually death if left untreated. Malnutrition in general was a constant threat, as food supplies were often scarce and diets were unbalanced. Stories of scurvy outbreaks in mining camps highlight the importance of a varied diet and the struggle to maintain health in the rugged conditions of the Old West. Which brings us to another deadly scenario. Number 4, cholera and waterborne illnesses. Cholera was a deadly waterborne illness that frequently ravaged settlements and mining camps in the Old West. Imagine the panic when a cholera outbreak occurred, with people falling ill rapidly and dying within hours from severe dehydration. Contaminated water sources were the main culprits, and with limited knowledge about sanitation, preventing these outbreaks was challenging. Entire communities could be decimated by cholera, leaving a trail of death and despair. The fear of waterborne illnesses was a constant concern, and finding clean water was a crucial but often difficult task. The next tale of terror involves number 3, forced labor and exhaustion. Life in the Old West could be brutally hard, especially for prisoners and laborers subjected to forced labor. Imagine working from dawn till dusk under harsh conditions, with little rest or adequate food. The grueling work, whether in mines or railroads or in fields, often led to exhaustion and death. Forced labor camps were notorious for their inhumane conditions, and many workers didn't survive the relentless demands. Stories of death from overwork and mistreatment are a stark reminder of the exploitation and harsh realities faced by laborers in the Old West. Now, let's delve into the deadly outcome of number 2, accidents with farm equipment. Farming in the Old West required the use of rudimentary and often dangerous equipment. Imagine working with a plow or thresher, knowing that one slip could lead to a fatal accident. These tools were essential for survival, but came with significant risks. Farmers often worked alone or with minimal help, increasing the chances of accidents going unnoticed and untreated. Fatal incidents involving farm equipment were common, and the lack of medical facilities meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening. The dangers of farming highlight the constant risk and hard work required to sustain life on the frontier. Last but not least, let's discuss the grim reality of number 1, execution by hanging. Hanging was a common form of capital punishment in the Old West, used to execute those found guilty of serious crimes. Imagine being in a small town, witnessing a public hanging as a form of justice. Notable executions, like those of infamous outlaws, were often community events, drawing large crowds. The legal process was swift, and once sentenced, prisoners were quickly hanged. This method of execution was seen as a deterrent to crime, but it was also a grim and final end for many. The use of hanging underscores the harsh and unforgiving nature of justice in the Old West. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.